kidding. Thank you for being both here in person and those who are joining us online. I'm Maureen McDonald, the Dean of the Faculty of Science and the incoming Provost and Vice President Academic at McMaster University. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to reflect on where we are. McMaster sits on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. That's an agreement rooted in shared care and responsibility for the land and its resources. That principle feels especially urgent today. Fires, floods, and other extreme weather events across Canada are powerful reminders that our relationship with the land matters. The title of tonight's event, Navigating the Storm, reflects those growing challenges that our communities face. What once felt distant is now a lived reality, testing our collective resilience. We believe that our panel tonight will bring together diverse perspectives from engineering, science, business, and a community of resilience. I'm looking forward to hearing their insights on how we can better prepare for and respond to these growing challenges. And it is now my pleasure to introduce McMaster's President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. David Farrar.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you all for joining us here this evening. At McMaster, we pride ourselves on research excellence and on our commitment to addressing some of the world's toughest challenges. Few are more urgent or more complex than climate change. We're seeing the human and economic tolls of wildfires, floods, and extreme weather, both globally and in our communities. These events affect our health, our infrastructure, our economies, and hit our most vulnerable populations the hardest. What sets McMaster apart is our collaborative, interdisciplinary approach. We bring engineers, scientists, health experts, business leaders, and policymakers to create real, practical solutions that account for both the technical and social impacts of climate change. In recent years, we've made this work a priority, and as a result, planetary health is now one of the pillars of McMaster's next fundraising campaign. Today's panel reflects that approach. You'll hear from experts from across fields who will help us understand the immediate effects of climate disasters and their broad impact on people and systems. So thank you again for being here, and it's now my pleasure to invite Heather Sheardown, the Dean of Engineering, to introduce the panel.
Thank you, David. I'm delighted to introduce our remarkable panel of experts who are tackling these challenges from different but deeply connected angles. Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Sarah Dixon Anderson, a professor in civil engineering and associate dean in the Faculty of Engineering. She brings valuable insight into water security and infrastructure resilience, especially in rural and remote communities where climate impacts are often felt first and most severely. Dr. Brent McKnight, associate professor of strategic management at the DeGroote School of Business. He studies how businesses and organizations prepare for environmental risks, helping us understand the economic and social dimensions of disaster response. Dr. Ramla Qureshi, assistant professor in civil engineering. She focuses on structural resilience during extreme events, with particular interest in how engineering intersects with social equality. And Dr. Nico Yanakouliasis, associate professor from McMaster School of Earth, Environment, and Society. His work maps the spatial patterns of climate risk, helping us to see where communities are most vulnerable and how they are perceived and respond to those risks. And guiding our conversation, he's not here yet, but is a McMaster graduate that many of you may know. Anthony Morgan, a leading science communicator and host of CBC's The Nature of Things. He's known for making complex science relatable and clear, which is exactly what tonight's topic demands. So please join me in welcoming our panel, and Maureen is going to chair the panel in Anthony's absence until he arrives.
We have to be ready any moment, right? Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And I'm going to start out with, we've got the structure of the panel this evening is that we have some questions that we're going to pose to the panel. We'll have an opportunity for me to sub out and Anthony to sub in when he arrives. And then we will have a brief period at the end for some questions from the audience, but just recognizing that we started a little bit late, and so we'll probably have a shortened time at the end. But the first question is, and I think I'll direct it first to you, Sarah, and then we'll pass it around.
Sure.
What's missing from the headlines about natural disasters? We know that there are lots of headlines, but what's underneath it that we're not hearing about? And the companion to that is what we are hearing about in the media, how is that shaping our understanding?
Yeah. So I would say one thing that's missing from the conversation is the long-range impacts of wildfires on, well, our environment. So my area is drinking water treatment. And so when there's a wildfire, it leaves behind a lot of ash, dissolved organic carbon, phosphorus, and that can impact water quality for decades. So I'll give you an example. Fort McMurray, after the 2016 wildfire, spent about $10 million extra over the next 3 years on their drinking water treatment, in things like extra chemicals, but also they had to change their treatment processes because a little known fact about water treatment, we think it's hard to treat dirty water. In fact, what's much harder is to treat water that changes in quality rapidly, and that's what happens following a fire. We get these plumes of contamination. So it is still a problem today. They're still spending extra money, like how many years later, on their water treatment.
It's interesting because we hear in the urgent moment, we see the evacuations, we hear the dramatic impact of residences, but to think what happens later on, and that example of water is a really important one that I wasn't aware of. Brent, I wonder, to the portion about politicization and political framing, can you give us a sense of what we're not hearing there and how that's shaping our understanding?
Yeah, for sure. I'd probably touch on three things, and one I think builds on what Sarah would say as well, is that every community is always, at all times, either experiencing a disaster, recovering from a disaster, or preparing for a disaster, right? There's no other state, right? It's always one of those three. And we pay a lot of attention to during the disaster because it's in your face, it's very present, you can see the effects, but it's actually the shortest period of time out of any stage in that disaster cycle. But that's what gets the attention rather than the longer term elements. I'd also say that we're fairly irrational about how we think about disasters. Who here has a disaster preparedness bag at home? Hands up. Actually,
Just
is it
kidding,
6?
I don't.
Yeah, I can't even put my hand up for this. Did you refresh it in the last 6 months, sir? No. Okay. Okay, I'm not. Yeah, does that? Excellent. Does that count? But fantastic that you've got that. But we don't think about these elements until it's too late, and quite often, we are much more comfortable with things that are certain rather than things that are uncertain, and that goes for investments that we make in our businesses or in our public spaces. The certainty of that investment is very real. The uncertainty of whether we'll benefit from that investment in the future is not so real, and I don't think our media is covering those risk elements. And I think the other thing I just want to mention is that we often talk about disasters, but we really need to distinguish hazards from disasters. A hurricane is a hazard. A disaster is what happens when a hazard meets an unprepared community, or a really large disaster, hazard I should say, I do it as well, hazard meets a community. So a disaster is the result of the interface of a hazard and a community. But not all hazards become disasters.
Nico, I wonder if I can follow up with you next. I know that this thing about like human behavior and our choices and how we assess risk is part of your expertise. What would you say to that, how we frame where our attention is and how that's being shaped in different ways?
Well, I think we had discussed this briefly as a group prior to the actual beginning of this session here. There is a tendency to diminish or we're a bit short-sighted about risk. We tend to underestimate the potential impacts, especially when we have to quantify them numerically. When you have to think about flood risk in terms of a 1 in 100-year flood, that quantification is really detached from a natural way of thinking, or the way that we think naturally. So the consequence is we often underestimate the risks until they happen, and then for a period of salience, we are very concerned, we are very activated about it, but then after a period of time, we lose attention again. And I'm not trying to malign any particular person. I mean, I think I'm as guilty of it as anybody. And it's very natural, right? We have to prioritize the immediate, and we tend to overlook abstract risks, which presents a serious policy challenge. Because how do you formulate policy when it's hard to maintain the attention and the level of concern from the public long term, when over a period of time they kind of lose interest? So, I mean, it's a struggle from a policy perspective, but also for regular folks in their normal everyday lives.
And what about systems dynamics? How can that play into this, Ramla?
That's a very loaded question, and I'll try to do justice to this. So I will come at it from a perspective of the built environment, right? As Brent very rightfully mentioned, that it's a wildfire is a hazard. Actually, wildfires, when we hear about wildfires, we think wildfires equals to bad. It's apocalyptic, it's bad. But what's actually bad is when that wildfire breached my city and started burning my structures and hurt my property. And that's where all the systematic and structural problems come in. I'd like to give some statistics here. Just this morning, earlier today, my student presented in a conference, and Natalie, if I say any of the digits wrong, please correct me.
This is a great opportunity for a student to correct the professor.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
On the stage.
Yeah, exactly. Be careful.
In British Columbia, we have about 198,449 structures that are in the wildland-urban interface. That is where wildlands and cities sort of blur the boundaries between themselves. These, some 200,000 structures, are in their direct line of fire, as we say, because these are directly under risk of forest fires moving as a front and affecting them. But forest fires don't just transfer, like heat transfer doesn't just happen as a flux, right? There's air, there's climate, there's all kinds of things, there's wind. So wind-based ember showers are a gigantic problem. And based on some of the research that is happening right now, wind-based embers can travel up to 10 kilometers. Conservatively, though, let's say it's not a very windy day, they do tend to still travel up to 1 kilometer. So if I just increase that buffer of the wildland-urban interface by 1 kilometer, we have 98% of British Columbia's built environment within the wildland-urban interface. We are not ready for this level of disaster. We're just not prepared. And it doesn't help that historically, structural design has been a bit relaxed about fire. We do a good job in assessing the hazard against, earthquake, for example, for Vancouver, especially Vancouver, Victoria, or mainland BC. But fire, we usually tend to just insulate and move on. Like, it's literally like, yeah, that's what the code says, and move on. And that brings me to, well, what does the code say then? Nothing. At this point, the National Building Code of Canada does not put any mandates about how to safeguard your structures. At this point, the main driver of change or structural change, and when I say structural, I mean the building structure, is insurance premiums. Having lived in BC during the 2023 Kelowna fires, personally, I can explain how horrific it is to be in the line of actual fire. And yet people, once it's gone, as you mentioned, and Nico, as you highlighted as well, people think, well, it's a 200-year event. I'm good. And that's just not how things work. So there's a lot of room to have public engagement around the perception of risk in all fronts, in structural engineering as well.
Yeah, it's eye-opening to think about those percentages and the vulnerability. And so I feel like you've all convinced me that we need to be paying attention to some other things. And but we did want to shift a little bit and ask about some examples where communities have responded to disasters in constructive and effective ways. We are big proponents of amplifying where we see excellence and where we see opportunities. So could you speak to how communities have addressed challenges like housing displacement or recovery planning, and perhaps what we could all learn from those responses, knowing that individuals can make a difference, and we can, if we elevate those stories, maybe we'll have a broader impact. So I think maybe we'll start with you on this one, Brent, thinking about planning, local adaptation, and organizational responses.
Yeah, no, it's a good set of questions, and we know, from Ramla's description too of how where the wildfire community interface is. It's often smaller communities that are most exposed to the wildfire hazards, and that means the smaller communities are very different than large communities in large cities like Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. So they kind of conditions the kinds of responses that we should be looking for. I think smaller communities have a characteristic where you've got individuals that are wearing lots of hats. I know in some research that we are doing, we're interviewing people. We're talking to a mayor. As I was talking to the mayor, he's in his car, he's driving to a restaurant that he owns. He's the owner of this restaurant. And then they're going, and I think he's a volunteer firefighter as well, right? And this is not an uncommon experience in a small community where people are wearing multiple hats as they're trying to deal with, the challenges in front of them. So you've got these people that have their day jobs, right? And then they're trying to deal with, a disaster that happens. So lots of burnout potential. But things that you see them do well are tabletop exercises are a common practice in communities. And a tabletop exercise is really just on a table or in some a venue where all the different actors that need to be around a table to make these decisions. So people like councillors or politicians or mayors, the fire department, the police department, schools, etc. And they're all running through different scenarios to help them think about how do we move people around during a disaster like fire. So that's one thing. So practicing, hard to do, but practicing, what to do, because everyone's going to be having to pull from their day jobs to disaster mode in the moment.
And Brent, can I ask you, is it possible that in that scenario, actually it's more effective because they are so deeply embedded in their community? It's a reality that it's that person's restaurant and their other role that is part of what's facilitating that in those small communities? Yeah,
it could be. I mean, communication could be easier, right? But you're still, you don't have professionals managing those scenarios. And, when your fire chief is having to put out normal fires, but also deal with the disaster, how long can that go on for? And so as it moves on, it becomes a real strain for people in the community.
Okay, thank you so much. Sarah, I know that you have some experience going in after these events and looking particularly at the water. Were there some exemplars you saw in the areas of perhaps partnerships and coordinated support systems?
Absolutely. So I would say that from what I've seen, the most effective disaster responses have really been grounded in strong partnerships. Ones particularly that empower local leadership, build trust, and strengthen social relationships so that there's that community capacity and cohesiveness. And also ones that bridge communities, public institutions, and researchers. So in a study we did post-Walkerton, we looked at their recovery and their community resilience 16 years after that disaster. And it was really interesting because it wasn't just infrastructure upgrades or policy reform that helped them recover, but it was actually the strength of relationships. and how informal networks stepped in at times where these formal entities were weakened and were stretched perhaps too thin. And so it's really that collaboration across sectors, I think. And the other thing that I think is important to note is it doesn't just happen in the moment. I think those relationships and structures, when they're in place, they help you prepare for a disaster. So that before the crisis hits, there's some sense of what people might do. So I think, looking forward, it's important to try and ensure that partnerships are truly authentic, that trust is really prioritized, and that when it comes to rebuilding, people look at it as an opportunity to rebuild a more resilient community.
I think this will really resonate with our host who has now arrived, because I know that part of his initiative is, in our world right now, creating spaces for difficult conversations where we can facilitate these types of relationships that will have the impact and the connections going forward. So it's been a long time since I've been in a game where I'm being substituted for, but I hear sub is being called from the timers table over here. So I would like to introduce all of you to Anthony Morgan, who is our host, and we're very proud of him to be an alumnus of McMaster University, and I'll welcome you to come and take over my seat here.
Hello, everyone. Hello. My sincerest apologies for my tardiness. I'll grab onto that. Thank you.
They're asking Nico. Yep.
Great. Thank you. Oh, great. Good to know. Thank you. So obviously, my sincerest apologies for my lateness. It takes about an hour and 40 minutes to commute here from Toronto. That time doubles to about 3.5 hours in the face of heavy rain and very thick fog. And so I cannot think of an experience that could better prepare me for an event like tonight. It really is as clear as possible that climate change is a much worse problem than I thought. So excited to be here with all of you, and excited to get to speak with each of you, the esteemed panelists for this evening. So I'm going to try my best to catch up. I know we've covered some of the ideas around sort of urgency, as far as why it's so important to implement some of these climate mitigation policies and strategies and techniques. And I think we were just wrapping up on some of the sort of human impact and the community impacts sort of thing. I'm going to try to pick up from where Maureen left off and ask about risk perception is an idea that's really important to me and close to my heart. As the host of the show, The Nature of Things, I spend all my time thinking about how do we talk to a public about climate change in ways that resonate with them, in ways that make sense to them, in ways that don't feel sort of fear-mongering, but that properly recognize the risks and challenges that we're facing. And so, Nico, I know that, this is a lot of what you spend your time thinking about. When you try to wrap your head around how to communicate the risks and how you shape the public perception, how are you thinking about doing that from the perspective of the work you do?
Yeah, I think I've learned a few lessons. One of the lessons is the importance of trust. I think that a person's perception about risk is framed by many things, including their personal experiences, but there are expert communities around, including the university, this university in particular, and other institutions, public institutions like the government, that can provide a lot of information that can help usefully frame our understanding of risk. That means usefully frame it in the sense of helping people make better decisions, better personal decisions, as well as influence politicians and policymakers to make better decisions. But in order to do that, you need to have a level of trust. So I think one element of perception that concerns me today, and I think it's an area where we really need to put a lot of emphasis, is on safeguarding loss of faith in expert institutions and increasing a sense of trust in the community so that people can go to experts and help improve their access to information that's accurate, meaningful, and important in making decisions in their life. So I think that's one thing that I consider really important. And another one is ensuring that we're linking these problems to the local. I think you spoke about climate change on a number of occasions. And what's interesting about most of the natural hazards, at least the ones that I'm aware of, is that many of the impacts are really local, right? It's really what we do locally that impacts our risks of flooding, for example. Those are local decisions. It might be that the frequency and the severity of flooding might increase over time, but the fact that there are floods in Hamilton, on the waterfront, and on rivers like in Calgary, in the Elbow River, it happens because of local decisions going back a long time in some cases, and sometimes recent local decisions. So I think when it comes to perception, trust and helping people understand that they actually have a lot more control over it than they think by situating in the local, in their own communities. And I think that that can have a big impact. Rather than getting into the psychology of risk, which might interest you, it's not my area of expertise, but my feeling is that I think there's a lot you can do to build trust and to help focus people on the local so that they feel empowered to do something about it. And I think that could actually make a big difference in meaningfully improving people's awareness in a useful way about natural hazards.
In a sort of systemic way, when you think about how you go about building trust as part of an organization, I mean, there are many organizations that are designed specifically to help us navigate some of these challenges. I'm thinking about the ways that in the United States, for instance, the response to some of the wildfires in California, people there were really having a hard time trusting officials before or after the fact. They argue that there was mismanagement, and when you think about governmental kind of strategy for building trust in the public, how do you think about that kind of thing, Brent?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think, the role of the private sector in disasters, we can look back to 2005. I was thinking about that 20 years ago was Hurricane Katrina. And that's really when a lot of the landscape of how disasters are managed by governments kind of changed quite a bit. Walmart, Home Depot, Walgreens, and others really stepped up in terms of their responses to disasters like that. And you're seeing like a whole community kind of response to disasters that wasn't there before. And fast forward to where we are now, and quite often companies are sitting on disaster, regional emergency operations centers, and they're part of those disasters. And so I think it does require a lot of engagement and a lot of time spent before disasters to build the trust that Nico's talking about, so that you can actually execute on it when that disaster actually strikes.
One of the things that I found happened during an experience like that one with the wildfires was that people generally tend to, nobody would claim that they are anti-science, right? Whether or not their beliefs tend to align with what the best evidence available in science has to say, people tend to claim that, well, I'm on the side of science, it's just that my experts are different than your experts. Yeah. And so I am a good scientist. How do you think about that and navigating that space, Nico?
Well,
it's tricky.
Yeah, it's tricky because who am I to tell a person that their science isn't authoritative? I don't feel like I'm in a position to do it. But I think trust comes from presenting the information as accurately as you can, not getting in the way of that exploration of information that happens with the public. I mean, the public is we live in an era where communication is just so easy. The communication of information in so many different directions is so easy. There's no point in trying to get in the way of it or regulating it. You present the best information you can. You uphold really critical values that I know are maintained to a high degree of a high standard in the Faculty of Science here at McMaster. But I think you have to preserve the integrity of your discipline. You have to act seriously. You have to remain as objective as you can and present your best face and hope that the public attaches themselves to your expertise. But the truth is, I don't think you can force it. I mean, my feeling is every attempt. I noticed this in the management of big questions around social media right now. And then from time to time, there are discussions about regulating social media. And I feel that this is counterproductive because I think it can compromise that sense of trust. I don't like social media. If I had my choice, I'd wipe it from the face of the earth. But I don't think regulating it is the right way to go because I think it can undermine trust. I think it's best to just present your best, do the best you can and hope that people gravitate towards you.
One of the things that I think people got confused about when thinking about the risks of fire is the actually occasionally helpful role that fires can play in managing our risk. I know that's something you probably spend a fair bit of time talking about. I don't know if we've covered that already. No, okay, good. So then I'm very curious to hear, what do you think it is that the headlines are missing when they talk about the role that fire can play, both as far as risk goes, but also as far as managing risk goes? Because people were hearing that, well, they didn't allow any of the normal controlled burns or the regular, like occasional fires that would happen. And because they didn't allow that, we got these catastrophic fires. What are we missing? As far as understanding how to manage those risks.
Oh, absolutely, and that's a very valid question to ask as well. I just touched on this previously, that we think of wildfires as bad, but wildfires are actually a crucial part of this planet's ecosystem and something that we absolutely cannot do without. Wildfires are healthy for the forests. The problem happens when now you have an uncontrolled burn, right? And that's coming from decades of policy where we had artificial suppression because we thought wildfires bad. And because of that, we now have forest floors that are full of kindling and are ready to burn, and that's a problem. I want to mention here that you mentioned Palisades fire, and you mentioned social media, and I work in structures under fire, so you can imagine my social media algorithm only showed me conspiracy theories, to the point that I was just pulling my hair out thinking, how on earth are people thinking there are blue lasers coming from the fire, all sorts of weird things that you can imagine. And in my frustration, I forgot how human it is to want to find reason in the face of absolute apocalypse, right? So it's a very human thing to do, to want to have some answers, even if those answers are absolutely hysterical in the midst of it. So at that time, I remember I went on TV and I busted some myths. And those myths were all about, well, why is that tree burning 5 kilometers away? Someone must have lit. No, embers, right? There's often very simple explanations, very physics-based explanations.
Gender reveal party?
My goodness. My goodness. I mean, you mentioned climate change. Majority of wildfires are human errors right now. So there's a lot of layers to that. And at times when it isn't fire season is when I think people like myself need to put ourselves out of our comfort zone in my small office that I'm very comfortable publishing and writing. I need to go out there and actually speak to people about, hey, why do you think wildfires are bad, and what can we do to actually look into that? I'm not trying to downplay the very real disaster that wildfires bring. But there's nuance to it around, okay, we've built into forest lands. How do we engineer our way out of this disaster?
I don't think that you'd be hard-pressed to find people who agree with you there, that I don't think social media is a place where you find an awful lot of nuance, necessarily. So you'll find people who will argue that, well, these wildfires are catastrophic, and then there'll be people who will argue, well, this is all just part of the natural cycle of things. And when you think about how the risk that flooding and fire poses to our societies has changed across time, has it gotten worse? Has it gotten better? Are we getting better at managing it in your experience? I mean, you've got programs like Fire Smart.
Yeah. So has anyone here heard of Fire Smart? Yeah. So just the one person raised their hand.
One very prepared person, yes.
So Fire Smart Canada is a wonderful initiative. It's literally firesmart.ca. I encourage you to explore their website, and all they're talking about is our individual preparedness in the face of wildfires. So we talk about defensible zones. So what that means is within 1 meter of your house, get rid of all shrubbery, all combustible items. Maybe look into steel shingles, right? Maybe have concrete decking and not the fancy timber ones, especially if you're in a wildland-urban interface. Then from 1.5 meters to about 10 meters, that's the intermediate zone. That's where Fire Smart Canada wants you to get rid of all flammable trees. And I specifically mentioned flammable trees because remember when we said wildfires are an inherent part of nature's system? That means that there are species of trees that have evolved to survive wildfires. So I actually wrote down some very Canadian species here. Let me mention
scavenger
them.
hunt after this. Okay.
Maple trees, poplar trees, aspens, cherries, and alder trees. These are fire-resistant species of trees. Within that intermediate zone, if you must have trees, make sure, so this is all coming from Fire Smart Canada, make sure these are not coniferous trees, which are extremely flammable and burn for a very, very long time, and also shed embers and are overall disastrous in that region. And then around 30 meters, which is about 100 feet or so, is where you start to look at, okay, now I'm probably entering woodlands. Maybe I can thin some of that woodlands in there.
Right.
But around that, this is called the extended zone. Extended zone, I as an individual can't really do much. That's where the municipalities come in. But one thing that Fire Smart Canada is really, really good at is pressing for community action. If I just safeguard my home and my structure in a front of extremely high temperature fire, but my neighbor still has things that are going to burn, neither of us are going to survive.
Right.
So it has to be a community-led effort, which is why Fire Smart Canada works with local municipalities. So you have their offices and their contact people in each city, in each municipality. Homework for everyone, please find out who the Fire Smart Canada representative is for Hamilton and adjacent areas. And maybe send them an email or call them and find out what we can do better.
I'd be curious where I might find a list like the one I guess FireSmart would be a good place to find that list. And if any of those trees are not in your front yard, or if you have any of the more fire-sensitive ones, then I guess maybe call your arborist sometime soon. But I'm really curious, Sarah, about how you've worked with communities that are quite remote and quite distant from populous areas. Is this kind of message getting through to them? Are they thinking differently about the risks that fires and flooding pose where you're looking? It could be about fire, but it could also be about flooding.
So in the communities that I've worked with, they're primarily in the territories, quite far north. No, these risks are very real to them. They understand and are, I'd say probably on high alert. Brent asked who has a preparedness kit, probably before you got here, but one person raised their hand.
Right.
I think in many communities that are probably at higher risk, kind of on that border that Ramla talked about, they are definitely thinking about these things. But I would say approaches differ. So one thing that I've noticed, and a good example, is Yellowknife. And in their response to the arsenic legacy from the giant mine. So they looked at, they had an interesting response to disaster. They looked at partnerships, but also they looked at collaboration amongst disciplines and also amongst knowledge systems. Mm-hmm. So they very much brought into play not only, technical remedial things on the landscape, but they facilitated conversations and brought in Indigenous knowledge into sort of long-term monitoring systems. And so I would say that they also have some different ways of thinking and doing things, and I think that those types of partnerships have worked really, really well.
That's really very exciting to hear about. Knowledge sharing seems like such an indispensable part of how we manage these risks because, we all have blind spots in our thinking about what we can do, and so it's exceptionally valuable. So you're seeing people adapt around the risk of fire. How are they adapting to the risk of flood? What are some of the success stories you're seeing there?
That's a tough question. Let's be clear. I've worked directly with about 6 or 8 communities, and one of them in particular has been actually flooded in the time that we have collaborated. And I guess the success piece that came out of it was that prior to the flood, it was a community that had a lot of social capital, so strong interrelationships between the community, and I would say that their ties to public institutions were less strong. That trust wasn't there. And through the recovery, I would say that some of those ties strengthened. So while the flood that they experienced, there was a lot of devastation, and it wasn't good, I would say that they are now on their way to being prepared for the next one. So if I don't know, what's the saying, out of lemons you can make some lemonade, I think they saw the opportunity to build a more resilient community, and that's what they're working on.
And when you think about how folks here might apply some of those lessons, I mean, it sounds like it's partly a conversation between sort of governmental organizations and communal bodies. Are there individual mitigation strategies that people are using as well, or is it just largely more sort of systematic and organizational?
So, okay, I'm going to speak maybe a little bit more systematically, and
Sure,
perhaps some
yeah.
of my colleagues might jump in on the individual pieces.
Feel free. Yeah.
But what I would say is that we have some really powerful tools. So I think a really important tool is evidence-informed policy, and another really powerful tool is education. So I think that we have a responsibility to be asking the questions of our community leaders, of our government, and of each other. What are the plans in place if we have a disaster? What activities are happening on the landscape? How are these decisions being made? What science, and actually it shouldn't just be, science, what evidence is informing these policies? And when we ask the questions, I think it kind of holds people to account, but it also, it makes things better.
Have you seen businesses or organizations coming together in the same way that Sarah's speaking about to kind of collectively face down these challenges?
Yeah, I think so. When we look at business responses to disasters, they tend to fall into 3 kind of categories. The first is like business continuity, where they're just staying up, right? I don't know if anyone has heard of the Waffle House Index down in the States, yeah. And this is no joke. I mean, they use the Waffle House. If the Waffle House is not open, it's real bad, right? So that's red, right? And so Waffle House is got a business continuity plan. They got generators. They got a stripped down menu. They got people that I don't know why in a hurricane they're deciding to go to work, but they are, and that's where the first responders start from, right? And in many cases, so business continuity is important, and about 85% of what people need to respond to a disaster, to get their life back together, is provided by the private sector. That's an old stat, but I bet it's pretty close to the case right now. So that's one, business continuity, staying up. The second one is around philanthropy, so lots of donations and lots of goods and of money to get people back on their feet. And the third one is disaster response, is actually being part of the response. And so I think all 3 of these, that might be providing flood management systems or data service centers that provide uptime. If you're in a flooded area, you can transfer to another data center. So actual solutions to a disaster problem. But I think all 3 of those pieces actually play into how a community responds. funds, right? They play a key role of businesses being open, of money being available to support those that have been really negatively affected, and then also, businesses that are taking an active role in helping to restart after a bigger disaster.
You speak about the differential kind of effects that communities might experience because communities are quite different from place to place. They face different kinds of risks. I'm curious, Nico, for you, when you think about sort of the patterns about who it is that is hit hardest, I mean, I think people tend to assume it's going to be communities that are on coastal areas, close to water. What are some of the more surprising communities that are being hit that folks might not expect?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question because my intuition about it ended up being wrong when I started doing research in this area. Because when you look globally at the vulnerability associated with flooding, it's typically coastal, and it's typically areas with weak infrastructure and no money. But in Canada, it's a lot more complicated. If you look at cities with rivers in them in Canada, there's an amenity value to living near a river. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that a lot of the properties most affected by the flood in Calgary, for example, were higher income, higher housing value homes. And this is true in Saskatoon. Not as much flooding happens there, but in Edmonton and a number of other cities in Canada where people live close to the river because it's got amenity value. It's nice to live near the water. But that's not true everywhere in Canada, because if you look in rural areas in rural Manitoba, downstream the Red River, there are a lot of Indigenous communities that are greatly affected by water diversion practices and so on, and flood control practices upstream. So there is a broad spectrum of vulnerability in Canada. It kind of depends where you are, which is not a surprise given the size of the country. But in urban areas with cities, it's often wealthier people in more expensive homes. And in rural areas, it's often the opposite. But that's not a universal rule.
It's quite surprising. I mean, unless you're on Twitter and you saw Drake's home was flooded, so we're all thinking of him. But I mean, it is interesting that there are these differential impacts. I'm curious about whether folks like Drake or people in these wealthier areas are changing their purchasing behavior as a consequence of some of these extreme events. Are you seeing people move to different areas? Because I remember being a kid and thinking and hearing about Tornado Alley, and hearing that it was always trailer homes in Tornado Alley that were being destroyed, and thinking, why do people keep setting up their trailers where tornadoes hit all the time? It doesn't make any sense. So you get older and you realize, well, that's where they can afford to. Are you seeing seeing changes in the demographics that are being hit across time? Are folks moving out of those areas from what you can tell?
Well, in some cases, I mean, there was following the 2013 flood near Calgary, including Calgary, but also east of Calgary, there was a purchase of homes. I think it was funded by the provincial and federal government. They basically bought 100 homes, and so people were relocated. So that does happen on occasion, but in general, the answer is no. If you're wealthy enough to live near a river, you probably self-insure. You have enough resources. You have the wealth to actually stay where you are. You may get a little bit of money from insurance, probably not, but you can finance the repair of your home and continue to live near the river until the next 1 in 50-year flood happens. So I think in general, I don't know that there's a lot of movement. I know that on occasion there is. Certainly there are municipalities in Canada that try to encourage through regulation or incentives people to move out of floodplains, but there's not. My feeling is that is not that common. And I don't know what Drake's response was, but in general, I think people stay where they are. I mean, there's a value to staying near your home, and so that's our tendency.
Well, I'm curious about what folks like that do then, if their decision is, my home has been destroyed, I'm going to rebuild, I'm going to stay where I am because I like where I am. Ramla, I'm curious about what kinds of strategies they're using when they're trying to rebuild their homes with those new risks in mind. I mean, you've studied, homes that are capable of withstanding extreme circumstances.
So this answer may shock you, nothing.
They're not doing anything.
At this point, based on our research, we're actually presenting a paper at a conference next week where we looked at risk adaptation in fire-prone areas in British Columbia and Alberta. And what we're doing is we're geophysically overlaying historic fires, the extent of damage, and new building permits after the fire. And we're also deeply navigating what that authority having jurisdiction is mandating as changes to, let's say, against wildfire. And sadly, in the absence of national building code mandates or even municipal mandates around building codes, many people are not doing much. I can give you some numbers for Kelowna from the 2023 fires. Right now, there's about $61 million of permits that have been issued in just the past 1 year, which means that people are going to build right there once again. The only thing that is a marker of change right now is insurance. The only thing that is driving people to maybe improve or have, some non-combustible siding or, like I said, some kind of non-combustible roofing or any of Fire Smart Canada's recommendations is that they get incentivized by the insurance because their premiums then go a little bit low. Right. However, I want to bring this one concept here that we all saw the Palisades fire, and we also saw how insurance companies basically, lifted their hands and said, well, we're out. Because what we're doing is we're insuring the risk out. We're not engineering it out. Right? And that's the fundamental gap at this point.
Right, using the economics to shape behavior is really the strategy then. I mean, not necessarily consciously on the behalf of...
Right, it's in the absence of nothing better,
right.
I would say it that way.
Well, I mean, it's really curious because you would imagine that governments might see like the need to sort of bail folks out of their homes or expend resources for emergency services. And after doing that and watching those homes burn down in that area, you would imagine that those governments would say, well, new building code mandates, you can't build your houses out of straw anymore in a fire-prone region. Why is it that they're not doing that?
So that's actually a very good question. We were just having this discussion just before the panel started. It's not like the government is bad and they're lazy and they're not. No, that's not the case. It's because there's so much nuance in this. There is so many different layers of, well, who's going to go inspect every single, sure, let's imagine that can be done as well. But then the nature of the wildland-urban interface is so different. At this point, we don't have a legal definition of what a wildfire is.
Really?
Because to be put into a building code, anything has to have a legal definition that will stand in court. At this point, because wildfires, you can call them forest fires, and that makes sense because that is still in the forest. But as soon as it breaches into a city, well, if a truck is on fire, is it really a wildfire? And there's more nuance to it, right? Governments tend to want to give grants to people affected in these areas, and governments tend to also want to do things for clout. However, then what happens is that people's perception of risk sort of dilutes all of a sudden because now they're getting grants to go live in a risky area. And now how do you navigate that? So it's not like the National Building Code of Canada is sleeping on it. We're looking at, I'm actually part of the National Model Code Committee where we're now bringing in things like performance-based design and resilience-based design to add to this nuance. But it takes time. It requires a lot of structure. It requires a lot of funding. It requires research. But at the governments right now, what they're doing is that they're giving this responsibility to authority having jurisdiction. So more local mandates are happening. We are seeing this in Jasper right now. It's a national forest, and because it's a national park. And because it's a national park, it is a federal authority. And because federal authority exists, and that's the only authority that exists, we're seeing much rapid changes happening in Jasper, which is really amazing to see. Yeah. So I can't sit here and, demonize a building code or a government or any person because there's just so many layers to how human beings behave.
I had the good fortune of visiting Jasper a number of times for their Dark Sky Festival before the fire, and I can say that they are an extraordinarily resilient community and one that gives me some hope because of that. But you're correct when you point out how complex this situation is. The climate is changing quickly. These threats are facing us more rapidly. They're more frequent and more extreme. I mean, collectively, are you optimistic? Do you think we have what it takes to meet these threats, to meet these challenges? I'll start with you, Nico. I mean, I spend a lot of time on campus in Toronto with young students, and there's a genuine sense of despair about our capacity to face down these threats. Are you optimistic?
Yeah, I think I actually am, because I think it's by and large in our control. I mean, I think that there are political and policy challenges to implementation. I think Ramla has outlined some of them, and I think that those are real. But I think it's a lot more in our control than we realize, especially when we talk about natural hazards like flooding and wildfires. I mean, in the case of flooding, as a homeowner, there are things you can do to reduce your risks. You can reduce your risk to overland flooding. You could reduce your risk to sewer backup. You could choose to do it or not. But I think when people are empowered to do something about it, that's encouraging. Municipalities can do things. I don't know how many of you live locally, but for those of us who spend time near Churchill Park, we know that Churchill Park has been re-landscaped. I like the aesthetic of the new Churchill Park. I'm not sure if that's universally agreed upon, but I like it. I like the way it is now, but it also serves a functional purpose. They re-landscaped it in part to slow the rate at which water's flowing into the sewer in the neighborhood surrounding the park. That's it was expensive, but it was a simple change that made a direct impact. So I think I'm optimistic because the science and engineering can do something about it. Individual homeowners, individual people can do something about it. However, if you spend your time thinking about climate change and the levels of greenhouse gas emissions, well, that's not going to feel we're not going to feel optimistic about that, because we feel powerless as individuals, and we're not optimistic about that ever changing. I mean, any honest appraisal of it right now is doesn't look really good. But the good news is that we can adapt. We have the means to adapt. We have the means to mitigate, at least locally. And I think if we put our emphasis on the things that we can do as homeowners and residents in our communities, and what our municipal governments can do. In Ontario, we've got conservation authorities, we've got municipal governments, we've got provincial government, all of which work together, often effectively, believe it or not, to actually make a difference. And again, I would highlight the effectiveness of Churchill Park. So,
Go Churchill. Are there resources you would point people to that they can go and check out themselves if they?
Yeah, actually, Waterloo, I'm reluctant to say, has worked they're associated with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and a few researchers there at Waterloo have done really good work to compile resources informing homes what they can do to protect themselves against flooding. So I can't quote the URL off the top of my head, but it's pretty easy to find. And Waterloo can be credited for putting a lot of really good material out there that people can find.
So that's Googleable.
It's Googleable.
That's great, yeah. Sarah, are you optimistic? I mean, you've seen communities adapt firsthand. You've seen them go through the worst of it, and you've seen them adapt. Are you optimistic?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. I think for me, hope lies in collaboration. But collaboration across disciplines, across jurisdictions and knowledge systems. And one example I'll give is I'm part of a pan-Canadian network that looks at how we can manage forests to protect our drinking water quality. And so we've collected a lot of evidence from Vancouver Island all the way to Halifax. And through that, we've linked, forest management with drinking water treatment, but with policy and with economics. And I think through that comes some real solutions. But I also think that to implement solutions and to operationalize solutions, I keep saying it, but we need strong relationships, right? We need to be... those relationships have to be rooted in respect and in knowledge sharing. But I think if we do that, we're in a position where we truly can learn and build more equitable, resilient communities that are prepared to face challenges.
What are the barriers that seem most common to you to building the kinds of relationships that you're talking about, those sustainable relationships?
I think trust. I think in my experience, when I collaborate with a community, it typically takes me several years actually to establish enough trust to dig in and get some real collaborative work done. And so, and I think our society, and this isn't my expertise at all, it's just what I see, but I think our society is in a place where it can be hard to trust even something you read, right, on the internet. So I think we have to find ways of establishing that to move forward. But I'm optimistic. I really, truly believe we can do it.
Brent, how about yourself? You're optimistic, or are you feeling kind of gloomy about things?
Maybe I'll hedge my answer there. I think definitely lots of technology. Like I don't think technology or solutions are what's holding us back from solving these challenges. We kind of know how to build the non-straw brick houses and the three little pigs kind of analogy. We know how to do that, but what we do sometimes lack is the will to put the dollars and the investment in upfront, when that risk is uncertain and when that future is uncertain. And I think sometimes government helps and sometimes it doesn't help. Like when you have a sense that the government's going to solve your problems if there's a shared risk, right? Oh, we have a flood, well, the government's going to fix that problem. Yes, they should because people are being affected, but at the same time, that shared risk creates a disincentive for action sometimes as well. So. And I think there is, we did an interesting study when we were looking at mining site managers, and there's a psychological closeness that they respond to, a psychological closeness if disasters are geographically close or if they, were just happened recently in the news or other elements, and they're more willing to take some effort to invest in preparing for disasters. But curiously, they really didn't necessarily know how much risk they were in. We had wildfire experts look at the surrounding area around the mining site to see how much risk there was to a wildfire, and the mining site managers and the experts agreed only half the time. So there is an element here that are people prepared to put investments in, and do they have enough knowledge and insight at the right times and the right places to do that?
I'm aware that I got here a little bit late, and so we're a little bit tight on time. So I want to follow on that and expand on it with you, Ramla. There's a concept of holistic resistance. 'Cause, he spoke quite eloquently about the need for people to become involved in problem solving, not just at the organization level, but at the individual level and everything in between. Can you tell us a little bit about what holistic resilience is and looks like?
Absolutely. Let me first make this a little bit philosophical. I want to say that all human beings are engineers. Or as I like to very nicely say, to engineer is human. So I do feel optimistic around that. It's in our nature to want to solve problems. What that also means is that at this point, we can no longer, I'll give you an analogy in engineering a structure. Just look around you. In this building that we are, somebody designed the structure, somebody did the electrical, somebody looked at the plumbing, but everybody had to be on the same table to coordinate. We probably need to do a similar thing. It's time to bring everybody together. Now, we cannot exclude folk anymore. People living in these areas, people living out of these areas, people spending the money, investors, government policymakers, you and I, everyone basically now needs to be involved, because unlike the hazards that were happening 40 years ago when most, let's say, engineering textbooks were being written, the nature of what we face right now is very rapidly changing, and that needs, well, all hands on deck.
You guys heard that, right? That's you guys. That's we're counting on you. I really like that because I'd say one of my core philosophies is the idea that I know less than 1% of what's on Wikipedia, and so do you, and so does every one of us. We all have these blind spots in our thinking, and the best way to find the blind spots in your thinking is by talking to people who see things a little differently than you do. They're kind of experts at it, and that's how I think we collectively build a sense of wisdom. And so with that in mind, I think I know we wanted to go to a Q&A as well for the audience, and so I don't know if we're ready for that or if we, based on timing, if we're going to be able to do that.
Oh, we got a question.
Sorry? Okay, yeah, we'll do a few questions then, and so I guess folks walk up to the, I got here late, I was meant to know about where all this happens, but I can see microphones over here and over here, so if folks have questions for our, well first, let's give a round of applause to our esteemed panel. They've been spectacular, and another round of applause for Maureen, who stepped in for me to moderate before I got here, so another round of applause to say thank you to her. You did a great job, I'm sure. But yeah, if you folks have any questions for our panelists, please feel free. That was a bit of a fake out, though.
Yeah, that was
but
major fake out.
surprised me. Okay, I think we've got somebody coming over to you with a microphone there.
Thanks, the panel and everybody. My name is Gabriel Ronen, and I'm emeritus professor here at McMaster and a researcher in CanChild, which is a Center for Childhood Onset Disability Research. And my main interest is the impact of climate disasters on people with disabilities, which I hope that this event will continue in different formats so we can cover a much bigger event of topics. I agree that we should be optimistic, but optimism means hope followed by action, and reasonable action, not just praying and hoping. That's one thing I think is we as humans are probably the worst and the most powerful species, and we should keep it in mind. And the last thing I want to say is that we all need to participate. It's not just what each of you do is a drop in the ocean. The drops accumulate to bigger pieces of water. So each of you, what you're doing will one day come together. And that's how we need to think about the future of dealing with disasters.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, those with disabilities or older individuals suffer quite a bit more during disasters. I think one thing that's been promising is to see the use of technology and different communications. I see they're piloting ride-sharing type of options as well, but we saw that in the Palisades being a real issue as well. So it's definitely something that needs to be front of mind for people planning disaster responses.
That's correct, but then we have middle and low income countries where most of the people do suffer from climate-related disasters.
Absolutely.
So I think I hear you saying that we have to do more than cross our fingers as tightly as possible, which is sage advice. Yeah. Is there oh, sure, go ahead, sorry, sir.
I do understand that you're optimistic because we alone stand, and that's why we're running this world. But we have a premier of an unnamed Western province that refuses to accept the fact that oil is dirty, especially the dirtiest oil, which is the oil sands. We have a recently elected leader of a country down in the States on the night of his election, drill, baby, drill. How do you answer that when you're optimistic? I'm looking at you two, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Who, us too?
Well, I know.
I mean, I don't want to take
I'm
it.
sorry,
You take
I'm
it.
sorry.
That's fine. No, sure.
You were the one,
Sure.
Nico, you were the one that said you were
Yeah.
optimistic.
Yeah, well, as I'd said in my response, I'm not optimistic that we're going to do anything about hitting our 1.5 degree limit. I don't think it's going to happen. And I think that's, and I think we live in a very complex world where there's a pull away from global action on everything, right? I mean, I think that when the next pandemic hits, we're going to be much worse off than the last one because we are less coordinated globally. So I'm not optimistic at that scale. And so my optimism is very local in the sense that I think in a country like Canada where we have the resources and we have the expertise, I think there's things we can do to adapt and mitigate. So I have a bracketed optimism. That doesn't mean I think the whole world is going to be better. It doesn't mean I think that we can solve every problem. But I don't think it's helpful. I mean, you'd mentioned students, pessimism amongst students. So I teach an environmental policy class. And my experience in having taught it for 8 years now is there's little to be gained by doom and gloom, because all I do is make them depressed and feel hopeless, like nothing can be done. And of course, there's a nugget of truth in that, right? If it can motivate you, great. But I think my experience is, and I actually think this is supported by the literature, that negative messaging doesn't motivate, it demotivates. What motivates people is finding, again, bracketing a problem that can be solved and then trying to solve it. And that doesn't mean you're going to save the world. And maybe we ought to reframe our morality so we are more broadly thinking and we think about the impacts of what we do more broadly. And I would fully agree with that. So I have a bracketed optimism that's really concentrated on what we can do, because I don't like to see depressed undergrads.
Or depressed old.
Oh, yeah, sure enough. Sure, yeah.
I would say, too, we're in a period of a lot of rhetoric that's going on, flying back and forth. And while it feels like it's been 2 or 3 years that all these changes have happened south of the border, it's actually only been five months, right? So that sounds crazy, right? How's it only been 5 months?
It's actually demotivating.
Yeah, it is demotivating, you're right.
Well, like I said, on election night, he was saying drill, baby, drill.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I think there is a lot of rhetoric, and it'll be interesting to see, and all the legal challenges and all those things take a lot longer than executive orders and whatnot. It'll be interesting to see how resilient the actions that firms that have taken are over time. And again, I don't know if I'm optimistic. I don't know that I'm claiming to be optimistic, but I'm interested to see how, how those that have taken action, how well it holds up. Yeah.
I can add a bit to that. My optimism is more community-based. So for example, in the case of wildfires, there's an example of the 2017 Thomas fires in Montesite, fire district, which should have been a devastating fire, but it wasn't, because this city or this town as a community came together and prepared for it. And actually right now are a hallmark of what can be achieved if all these people work together. Because wildfires or fires are in general, or floods are not new, they've been here forever. And that's what I said, that we've been engineering solutions to them forever. And that's where I have hope that we can engineer solutions and we can come together, albeit a bit slowly, because we have to navigate around politicians, but I have hope that that's possible, because we see examples of that happening.
If there seems to be one thing that humanity is pretty good at, it's figuring it out just before we all die. So, good track record that way, and hopefully, well, no, I won't just cross my fingers. We'll do more than that. But, sir?
I think over here first.
Oh,
thank
sure.
you. Thanks for this panel. It's been great. I had a question related to a specific book, which maybe none of you have read or looked at, but I think you can hopefully get. I'll give the very quick synopsis of it. So the book is called A Good War by Seth Klein, and he uses World War II as a roadmap for how we can mobilize against this world of change that we have, and he basically outlines 4 main things in it, which is to spend what it takes, to create new institutions, to don't encourage change, require it, and to tell the truth. So again, that's spend what it takes, create new institutions, don't encourage change, require it, and tell the truth, which is what we did during World War II when we faced, one of the greatest threats democracy in the world has ever faced. And I'm wondering, I guess, kind of thinking about those 4 main ideas that he outlines, if you could speak to any of them about the importance of telling the truth, about the importance of creating new institutions, what kind of institutions would be effective, and if we aren't going to just encourage change, how might we go about requiring it from people? Because again, during the war, we did require change. We didn't just ask for it. We said, this is a real emergency, and let's get people on board. So, yeah, spending what it takes, create new institutions, don't encourage change, require it, and tell the truth. Would love any thoughts on those. And would strongly encourage everyone to go read the book, A Good War by Seth Klein. It's a fantastic read.
Anyone care to share on that?
Well, without having had a lot of time to think about those things, I'm thinking about particularly creating new institutions, and I wonder if perhaps things have changed. Like, when you create something new, sometimes you have to leave something behind. So I think it takes a lot of doing some of the things we've talked about, figuring out what's working, what's not working. One of the examples I had in my back pocket today was to talk about the multiple barrier approach to protecting drinking water and how it's a great framework, but it doesn't work. It's not operationalized well. So to look at things like that and perhaps think about how to reimagine institutions, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, very useful strategy, I think. I spend a lot of time thinking about, people tend to imagine that facts are what change people's minds, and as we talk about, politicians out west or down south or wherever, what I've found from the data is, and having worked with organizations like Science at First, they're all trying to fight misinformation and protect the institutions like science that you're talking about, is surprising. I'm surprised what I've learned. Facts don't seem to change minds. This is perhaps not surprising given that we've all just lived through a pandemic and we've seen firsthand that is the case. But what does seem to drive behavioral change is targeting identities. If you believe that the identity that you subscribe to behaves X way, then you are likely to do the same. And so maybe targeting that is maybe a useful avenue. I'm curious to know from your experience working with communities, what seems to drive behavioral change in your experience?
Within a community that's facing a disaster?
Yeah.
I think the need for security,
right,
frankly. So I think that when something is right at you, for example, a flood or a fire, so this one particular community went from floods in the spring to fires in the summer, and their whole 6 months of their year was all about looking for security. And I think that really drove change. And I spoke about it a little bit in that as they recovered, what they looked to do was to build something more resilient, to build a better community, so they've got plans in place for the next time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'd be really curious I can't wait to chat with you some more after this as well, because it's going to be really neat. But I can see we've got one more question here, and I don't want to leave you waiting, sir.
Okay, so my name's Dan Wayner. I come from Ottawa. Before I retired, I was the chief scientist at the National Research Council. And first, I just want to thank you for a very informative and stimulating discussion tonight. And I'm particularly impressed with the commitment that each of you have to working with communities. The question that I have is, all of you at some point have spoken about trust, and Sarah talked about how it can take years to work with a community to trust, but we live in a world of echo chambers, and in a world where there's increasing distrust of experts of any kind. And I guess the question is, there are more communities than there are of you to build trust. So how do we start to reach out more into our society as a whole to start to reestablish the trust that scientists and engineers had when I was a kid?
Well, that's easy, cloning, but I'll let you. I'll let you all expand on that. So, does anyone want to start, or yeah?
I don't know if this is going to answer your question directly, but I do think our systems are good at responding when we can scale them. So often we solve our problems by scaling, new products or new services. But the challenge we've got with community-based responses, and we've all talked about how these responses are all local. We're optimistic about the local elements, but scaling, the trust and the application of knowledge and understanding at a community level requires us to think very differently. It's the same kind of things when I deal with social innovation or other kind of community-based solutions. It's a replicating problem, not a scaling problem. And I think we don't spend a lot of our time talking about how do we grow by replicating. We talk a lot more in our like entrepreneurial systems of how do we take a product and put it into a scale engine like a pharmacy or like a large organization. And I think we need to spend more of our time thinking about how do we scale custom, localized solutions to problems. Any funders out there that want to help us with that vision?
I can speak a little bit to my experience. So I think the way that I've always built trust with a community is to meet them where they are. So as an example, I worked with a community, Northwest Angle 33. They had radionuclides in their water, so do not consume order. And I went there and I looked at their drinking water treatment plant. And she said to me that the water treatment plant operator there said to me, "You're the first person who's ever actually come out to physically see this." And she said it was shocking to me. She didn't have equipment that one would need to run a plant. So she said to me, "Can you come to my chief? Can you help me advocate? I need a turbidity meter." So it's it's meeting people, I think, where they are, and giving them a reason to trust you. So to come back, to show up, and to keep showing up. And then you're right, scaling that's really hard. One thing that we have tried to do is to build a community of communities. So to hold, workshops. My real expertise actually is water security, community water security, so not necessarily disaster recovery, but that may be part of it often. So to hold workshops among communities who can share knowledge, share lessons, share strategies. So that's one thing.
Often one thing that we skip out is the power of soft messaging. Pop culture, make a song.
Yeah. Taylor Swift. We all need Taylor Swift.
Really.
Over a parking lot.
Yes. I mean, it's super powerful to create change and making sure that it is present in each household, in each kitchen table. So pop culture, where we really need to start speaking to someone in there as well.
I could not agree more. So if any of you are responsible for personally representing Taylor Swift, please come and speak with the panel at the end of this. But I can see that we are out of time. So if you could join me once again in a round of applause for our panel and thanking them so much for your participation.
Okay, before I begin, the gentleman plugging A Good War by Seth Klein. I feel like you might be Seth Klein. You're not Seth Klein? Okay. All right. Sounds good. First of all, what an interesting and thoughtful discussion this evening. I'd like to extend my thank you to the panel, Sarah, Brent, Ramla, and Nico, and of course to our moderator, Anthony, for braving the weather and the drive this evening, and to Maureen, who started as our moderator and was subbed out. I will note that after she was subbed out, she was never subbed back in, which might suggest you need to work on your game. So tonight reminded us of something really important, and that's that climate change is a complex issue, and the solutions require collaboration across sectors and disciplines. At McMaster, we're focused on fostering those connections, bringing together people and ideas to support communities, inform policy, and guide business decisions that shape a more sustainable future. This is just the beginning. McMaster is set to be a leader in this space, and tonight's event marks the first in a series of conversations designed to drive real progress. If you're interested in learning more or getting involved, please don't hesitate to speak with one of our McMaster colleagues here this evening. We welcome your feedback on this event and on any topics you'd like to see explored in future sessions. Your ideas will help shape what comes next. Before we close, I'd like to invite our panelists and our moderator to accept a small token of our appreciation from all of us at McMaster. Thank you for sharing your time, insight, and expertise.
Thank you very much. Taylor Swift tickets. They go for like $14,000, I auctioned some off. It was unbelievable. Yeah. so much. Very much appreciate that. Thank you. I'll be patient. So I won't keep you again.
To everyone here in person and to those joining us online, thank you for being part of this important conversation. I hope you're leaving tonight with new insights and inspiration, whether through your work, community involvement, or personal commitments. Thank you and good night.